Good evening, everyone. Gentleman Game Master here. Happy New Year to you all. Tonight, I wanted to do a quick video on something I've been thinking about lately, something I've been using in some of my games. Initiativeless combat. Literally, just throwing initiative out the window. And I know a lot of people probably scoff at that if you play D&D all the time. And I will say, there are good times to use it in D&D, in 5e, and there are a lot of times where you're not going to use it. But I will say that in more role play heavy games, I have been using this more, and it's been working. I've found that if the players trust their DM, if you're not a DM that is out to get your players, this works just fine. And there's still a lot of challenge, and there's still a lot of suspense. Actually, even more. I've been using it in Morkborg, Tales from the Loop, Aliens, just doing away with initiative altogether. And I will get into that and explain it a little bit more as we talk. But first, what had me thinking about this is I used to play a game called Final Fantasy Tactics. Final Fantasy Tactics, I mean, I guess you could say it's a Japanese role playing game or video game. And the thing about that RPG was that you had a lot of options in building your skirmish, your small militia of characters. You could choose wizards and you could choose all the different classes you'd have in Final Fantasy, but you as the player were controlling about 6 to 8 of these characters. And the core of the game was combat. Getting to those small skirmishes where you could try to use every space on the board, every strategy to your advantage. It literally was high level fantasy chess. And in between that, there was this grandiose story going on, right? But it was told through some dialogue, some cutscenes, and then you'd go to another battle. I think 5e has become one of two things. You either are sitting at the table with players who love the role playing aspect, and then it's just 3 hours of role playing, maybe in a market. And then you have those other players or those other groups where every game is 3 hours of combat and very, intricate, strategic, down to the 5 feet into every rule and flanking rules and all of that. And so what I'm here to say is that I think there's a call for like a balance between both of those. Like I always think, why does that amazing feeling of dramatic narrative have to come to this crashing halt every time there's combat? And let's face it, combat is a big part of 5e because at the core of it, 90% of what's on your rule sheet or your character sheet is for combat. Half that stuff you don't really use outside of it, right? And if you think about, I've started to approach combat the way you approach really interesting social encounters in the game. Like, say the parties just met the king or a duke of a town or of a land, and there's always everyone's on edge when they're trying to convince this NPC that could, sick his guards on everyone in the room. Everyone is very kind of on eggshells with every word that they say, never knowing when the DM is going to ask for a persuasion check or an intimidation check. And you never know if you're like, it's right up to the moment. And then suddenly something happens and then it's roll for initiative. And then all that tension build up stops. And everyone takes a break and rolls initiative, maybe takes a bathroom break and puts everything in order and then comes back. And then you try to build that tension again. And it's never quite the same. But what I've been noticing when I don't do that, it can make for some really cool, dramatic moments. So you might say, how do you do initiativeless combat? Well, this is the way I treat it. Trust your players. You really have to make sure they understand that you're going to do this. You can almost have to break for a moment and say, hey, I'm opening up the table for anything to happen here. And I want everyone to know, treat this session, this moment like combat, but you can act out of order. Anyone can go. It can be weird at the beginning, but you can kind of start to lead players but once it starts to flow. So the way it works is to treat a round of combat just like you would with initiative, except for anyone can react. So just like normal when you're role playing and you set the scene as a DM and you go, what do you do? Or I turn it over to you players, or what's happening? Someone can jump in and say, I do this. They make an attack roll, they cast a spell, they do their bonus action. And at the core, they describe everything very narratively. As soon as they finish, the DM, you're describing the reaction of the villain. How does the villain kind of respond? Maybe, and then you go, what happens next? You leave this open answered question, and then suddenly combat is this. It's less of this hard ruled board game, that you're playing, and it suddenly becomes a conversation between people telling a story. And maybe something the one character did, they shot their arrow and it slammed into the monster's shoulder. And as the monster took damage, suddenly the ranger leapt forward with the scimitar and slashed the monster across the chest. And it just continues to go. Well, you go, well, what about the monsters? In this way, it probably behooves you to build your monsters a little bit more badass. You have to make your monsters strong enough to where initiative shouldn't make or break whether they go last or early in the combat. And I honestly think initiative should never make or break a combat. Like if you build an encounter and it's complete trash if the heroes have full, if they get the upper hand on initiative, or vice versa. If the heroes are going to lose if the monsters roll high initiative, that's not a really compelling combat. So, because then the players feel cheated. They know that just by the luck of the draw, they're going to lose this fight. And they'll know early on. So instead, give the players the benefit of the doubt. You give the story to them. And what happens is every character acts, they've acted for their round, just like an initiative. And when they're all done, then you move to the next round. Well, then you go, well, what about the monsters? Well, here's what I do. I tell the players before, as combat breaks out, I'm turning this over to you. This is initiativeless combat. But the more you falter, the more you think about the more you look at each other, like who's going to go next. I will, as the DM, not I, but the monsters or the antagonists in that moment will seize those moments. They will capitalize on those moments and they will try to take you out. So there are many times when I've done this where someone attacks the monster gets hit, the monster reels from the attack, and then I go, what happens next? And everyone looks at each other like, I don't know. Who should go? And then that monster responds, attacking that person who just attacked it. And that way, suddenly combat starts to feel more like the way you read it in a story or the way you watch it on a screen. It's very much give and take. Like a lot of times in D&D, you have someone attack a bad guy, but and they're at initiative 20, the bad guy's at initiative 1. So I have to wait till initiative 1 to see how the bad guy responded to that attack. Why? Why not? If the players are faltering, he attacks, she attacks, it attacks, they attack. It just happens. And your players get used to it very quickly, and suddenly you have this really compelling narrative combat happening. And it's still fair because players can't go multiple times, right? A cleric is only going to be able to do their bonus action for for healing or whatever it may be, and do their main action. When they're done for that round. And you can, as a dungeon master, it becomes easy to kind of check off who's gone. And you as a DM, if the players are working very well together, you kind of let them weave these cool moments together. It starts to feel more cinematic when the ranger landed an arrow shot and then the other character responded, flipping over the back of the monster and slashing its leg, and then the monster staggered, and then and then someone else jumped in and cast a spell holding the monster. It becomes that way. If the monster goes last, the monster goes last. But just make sure the monsters are strong enough to, when they go last, they still have an impact. That's the only thing that could be that it can feel, if you as the DM are not overly aggressive. It could be very cool, but it could also be weak if you're not willing to like go there. So you have to play fair as a DM, right? It requires you to take a step back and go, okay, give them the benefit of the doubt. But if they don't take advantage of it, boom, hit them. Every time they don't take advantage of it, then you let your monsters respond. And then if they are taking full advantage, hopefully you got a little bit of something left for the end of the the round to go at them. And I start using this because like games like Mort Borg had the old school kind of them all or nothing. It had you roll a dice and either all the heroes go or all the monsters go. And I was like, that's not compelling to me. That's never really worked really well. And so I was like, why throw out an Alien that I play had more of just a luck of the draw. You lay out some cards and it's like either heroes and it just puts it in a you draw cards and then the order of combat. Why? There was no at least in D&D there was initiative, right? You have initiative. You have a that plays into why someone will react before someone else. And speaking of that, another way you cannot take that away from someone, because you're like, maybe the player is maybe there's a rogue player who has high initiative, but maybe the player themselves is a little bit more timid and less likely to react and say something. Well, yeah, that could suddenly you go, oh, Malcolm, in these initialist combats, suddenly there's going to be people that are always reacting last and not getting the benefit of who their character is. Well, in those situations, if you know who you're playing with, you call those people. You call on them. You go, "Oh, hey, the rogue. What do you do? You're probably faster than most people. What are you doing?" Do that, or say everyone's stalling, and a monster goes to attack the rogue, and you know that the rogue could get the jump, and if the rogue gets the first attack off, then they're going to get the I forget what you call that rule, but like the assassinate rule, where if they attack first, they do it more damage in that first round of combat. Then make them roll initiative. Say this monster is attacking you, roll initiative, which is essentially just a dexterity check, a roll off. It's kind of like a grapple check between two characters. It's no different. If the monster fails, then give it to that player, and now treat that after that initiative. Treat that as knowing your mind as a DM that player is going to have the opportunity over most of the monsters to attack first. Yeah, it could seem a little convoluted, right? It could. If you like I said, if you play D&D like Final Fantasy Tactics, then this is not something you would implement. But if most of my party, most of the people that I play with love the role-playing aspect of the game. They like the combat too, but a lot of times I know my players, and my players love the role-playing so much they don't want the combat to slow down. And I've noticed that I don't do this all the time. Like I said, again, if there's a big major, I don't know, maybe boss battle where I know that strategy is going to be a big part of it, then yeah, it's going to be miniatures on the board, spaces and all that. Measuring where you're at. Sometimes like I said, a combat just calls for that. And then sometimes, maybe in quicker battles, when you just want it to feel like a heat of the moment, you play it out like this. And I think that what could also just help most of us as DMs is to what keeps your players on their toes, is to surprise them, is not to get too comfortable. Don't let them to get too comfortable in knowing how the combat is always going to play out. Like, oh, Malcolm's always going to like bust out the map and the monsters and miniatures. Sometimes combat's just going to be really quick. Sometimes it's going to be really long. Oh my God, I don't know. And that way, you keep the game fresh. So I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Would you use initialist combat? If you did use that, how would you do it? Would you do it differently than what I'm saying, where I'm basically saying people get to go their turn whenever they call it, as long as they just take initiative, and monsters go whenever they take initiative, right? What would you do? I mean, I also do a thing where based on distances, right? So if a monster goes to attack someone and that person is 40 feet away, then I give them the benefit of the doubt and say, this monster is rushing towards you. It's going to attack. What are you going to do before it closes in on you? Give them the opening. So I don't know. I find that it's worked. It's worked really well. And honestly, it's ripped kind of directly from the way Tales from the Loop's Free Leagues games work, where it really is just open. Because I love the narrative aspect of these games that we play. And I find combat is so much more interesting when it feels that way, when it doesn't feel like it's all just dice and miniatures, and when suddenly those miniatures are just tools to really get to what's happening up here. What do you guys think? Let me know. That's it. I'll go ahead and finish my little makeshift old fashioned, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Good night.